What if I told you that some of the most powerful meals in history were cooked with no spices, no recipes, and almost nothing in the cupboard? They weren't luxurious, they weren't pretty, but they kept generations alive through plagues, famine, and back-breaking labor. These weren't meals for celebration, they were meals for survival. And behind every bubbling pot and stale crust was a story of resilience, desperation, and raw human ingenuity. Today, we scroll past dinner options with a swipe, but medieval. Peasants, they built an entire food system out of scraps, roots, and unbreakable willpower. This isn't just a story about what they ate. It's a story about how they refused to starve. 1. Pottage, the lifeblood of peasant diets. A thick, slow-cooked stew made from grains like barley, oats, and rye, constantly simmered over fires, with new ingredients added daily. Main ingredients: cheap grains, root vegetables, and rare bits of meat or fat for flavor. It was nutritious, long-lasting, and consumed multiple times a day. In a world where food is photographed before it's eaten and tossed away when it's a day too old, it's hard to grasp what hunger really meant to those who lived 8 centuries ago. But imagine waking up before dawn to a life of back labor with no certainty about what or if you'd eat that day. No grocery stores, no meal delivery, no safety net. Just you, your family, and the thin hope that something edible still lingered in the bottom of the pot. This wasn't some momentary inconvenience. For medieval peasants, this was life. And food, or the absence of it, shaped not only their days, but their destiny. What did survival taste like in a time of endless toil, plague, and famine? What kept entire villages going when the weather turned, the crops failed, and winter bared its teeth? The answer isn't glamorous. It isn't Instagrammable, but it is extraordinary. Because behind every faded stone wall and every crumbling manuscript lies a truth we've forgotten. Our ancestors endured, adapted, and invented meals from the absolute edge of possibility. This story isn't just about what they ate, it's about what they survived. Let's begin where the hunger always simmered, the firelit heart of every medieval home, the pottage pot. Picture this: a blackened cauldron hangs above a smoldering hearth, its contents bubbling slowly, not for hours, but for days. This wasn't just a meal, it was a method, a mindset. Pottage was more than food. It was insurance, community, tradition. In the peasant home, the pottage pot rarely cooled. Ingredients were not added all at once, but in shifts: scraps of barley, yesterday's turnip, a spoonful of dried peas, the last wilted cabbage leaf, maybe, if fortune smiled, a nub of salt pork. It was the medieval answer to the never-ending buffet, except it wasn't indulgent. It was strategic. Nutritionally, pottage was a slow-drip survival formula. Its grain base, often barley or oats, supplied carbs. The added vegetables brought fiber and sparse vitamins. On rare days, a dash of animal fat rose to the surface, lending calories and flavor to otherwise grim sustenance. Medieval life didn't pause for flavor, but sometimes flavor was found in the smallest mercy: wild garlic, chopped leeks, or the leftover bone from a distant festival. Pottage evolved with the seasons and the land. In winter, it shrank to root vegetables and grain. In spring, it bloomed with foraged greens. For nobles, it was a base, an appetizer before the main feast. For peasants, it was the feast. There was no recipe, only rhythm, and like a musical refrain, it played every day. Archaeological digs confirm this continuity. Traces of soot-lined pots with embedded grains and charred root fibers, tell a story of daily endurance. And yet modern readers may scoff, who'd eat the same thing every day for weeks. But to judge it by today's palate is to miss the genius of it entirely. In a world without refrigeration, preservation wasn't an option. The continuous simmer was a form of food safety, keeping bacteria at bay and flavors alive. It was slow cooking as survival, not indulgence. Even more telling, in some households, pottage simmered for months. Added to every day, never emptied, only thickened with time. That longevity turned food into history. In a way, peasants weren't just feeding themselves, they were feeding a tradition, passing it forward, ladle by ladle. It wasn't exciting, but it worked, and it was shared. Food wasn't plated, it was communal. One pot, one spoon, one story repeated night after night, with small variations and even smaller luxuries. And what pottage lacked in prestige, it made up for in perseverance. If bread was the body of medieval faith, pottage was the soul of its endurance. 2. Peasant bread, dense, dark, and dangerous. Made from rye barley, often hard and mixed with fillers like peas, beans, acorns, or bark. Weekly communal baking, grew mouldy by week's end, often dunked in soup ale to eat, susceptible to ergot fungus, St. Anthony's fire, which caused hallucinations or death. If pottage was the heartbeat of the medieval home, bread was the backbone, hard, unyielding, and ever-present. But forget everything you think you know about bread. There was no crusty baguette, no golden sourdough, no light sponge of white toast. Peasant bread wasn't just rough, it was survival baked into a brick, often dark as soil, heavy as a stone, and hard enough to chip a tooth by week's end. It was nonetheless essential, not for pleasure, but for power. Because in a time where manual labor defined existence, calories were currency, and bread was the bank. But even that came at a cost. The best grains, soft, golden wheat, were luxury items reserved for nobles and the church. What peasants had access to were the scraps, rye and barley, grown in poorer soils, coarser to grind, and far less forgiving in texture. And grain was only the beginning. To save money at the Lord's mill, where fees were mandatory and often crushing, peasants diluted their flour with fillers, not just peas and beans, but crushed acorns, chestnuts, straw, and even powdered bark. Imagine that, bark in your daily bread, not as garnish, as substance. And yet, it worked, not because it was tasty, but because it filled the void. Bread delivered upwards of 60% of daily calories. Some laborers ate 2 to 3 pounds of it per day. Women and children ate nearly as much. This wasn't gluttony, it was strategy. When your life revolved around fields, plows, and hauling timber, you didn't eat for enjoyment. You ate to stay upright. The weekly bake was a ritual in itself. Without private ovens, many villagers relied on communal baking, a shared furnace fired just once a week. Families would line up, loaves in hand, marked with a distinct stamp or score so they wouldn't be mixed up. And these loaves, dense, dark, and baked hard, had to last until the next round. As the week wore on, they grew tougher, drier, even mouldy. By Thursday, eating one meant dunking it in ale or soup just to make it chewable. By Saturday, you were praying Sunday came with a new batch, and sometimes it didn't. Yet, bread was never disrespected. It was sacred. To steal it was to steal life. To waste it was sinful. Even the mouldy crusts found a purpose, crumbled into gruel, mixed into pottage, or fed to animals. Bread wastage was nearly zero. But for all its reverence, bread was not. Without risk, rye, common in peasant regions, was a dangerous friend. In damp conditions, it grew ergot, a toxic fungus packed with alkaloids. Ingest enough, and it didn't just make you sick, it made you hallucinate. Spasms, visions, convulsions, even death. Entire villages, unaware, fell victim to what they called St. Anthony's fire. What they didn't know was that their daily bread had become a poison. Still, they kept baking, because there was no other choice. Bread was more than food. It was ritual. It began every meal, ended every meal, and bridged the gaps between famine and feast. In times of scarcity, families survived on bread alone. And when grain ran short, the bread adapted thinner, meaner, laced with whatever might stretch it just one more day. No sauces, no sides, sometimes not even salt, just dough and fire, and yet it fed nations. Bread was protest. It was pride. It was the one thing everyone fought for, from kings to beggars. And for the peasant, it was both comfort and curse, the thing they labored for, and the thing they could never quite get enough of. 3. Gruel, bare-bones survival food, extremely thin boiled grain water, often used in famine, monasteries, or illness, low in nutrients and taste. Monks, the sick, and children often consumed it. Imagine a meal so thin, so devoid of flavor, that even medieval dogs, notoriously unfussy, were said to turn away unless on the brink of starvation. That meal was gruel. If bread was the spine and pottage the pulse, gruel was the last gasp, a culinary white flag. It wasn't just poor man's porridge. It was the ultimate stretch tactic, designed not to nourish but to delay death. Gruel existed in the spaces between other foods, the fallback when the root cellar was empty, the pottage pot scraped clean, and the bread loaf gone hard as stone. It was what mothers gave children when there was nothing else, what the sick sipped when chewing. Was impossible what monks ate when fasting demanded penitence in every bite. But calling it a bite is generous. It was closer to flavored water. The recipe, if you could even call it one, was stark. A small handful of grain scraps, oats, barley, sometimes millet, boiled in a large pot of water until the contents surrendered into something halfway between broth and sludge. Salt, if you were lucky, a wilted herb, a miracle. But mostly, it was a silent, grey ladle of nothing. And yet, it mattered. Gruel wasn't meant to satisfy. It was meant to fill, to line the stomach with something warm and heavy enough to simulate fullness, even if the body knew better. During the worst famines, monasteries stretched a single cup of oats into gruel for 10 mouths. Do the math. That's under 2 tablespoons of actual grain per person. And yet, for the destitute, the elderly, the starving, it was better than nothing, barely. In fact, gruel had a kind of spiritual reputation. Monasteries across Europe consumed it ritually during Lent and fasting days, sometimes adding luxuries like honey or dried fruit, additions that were a fantasy to ordinary villagers. It was a form of controlled suffering, of modesty before God, but for peasants, that modesty was just their regular Tuesday. And when infants were weaned, they didn't graduate to baby food. They graduated to gruel. For children too young for bread and too weak for pottage, gruel was the gateway meal, and tragically, sometimes the only meal. Medieval court records tell grim tales of children who died of malnutrition despite being fed regularly. the small print being that they were fed gruel and little else. In households with nothing left, gruel became the main meal. Its thinness wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. You could stretch it. You could pretend it was enough. And sometimes that illusion bought another day. And here's where things get psychologically complex. Because despite its reputation as meager food, gruel was also an anchor. It gave shape to the day. When everything else failed, when the rains didn't come, when the crops died, when the bread ran out, there was always the gruel pot. Always a reason to stoke the fire. Always something to hold the hunger at bay, if only for a few hours. Yet this loyalty to the most underwhelming meal speaks volumes about medieval life. In a time where survival wasn't just difficult, but often arbitrary, food became more than nourishment. It became ritual, repetition, even reassurance. Gruel was the edible version of "we're still here." Thin, yes, but present. And in a world that gave peasants so little, that presence was a kind of victory. For turnips, the forgotten staple, easy to grow, store, and cook, edible root and greens, turnip stews and soups were key during winter months. Became monotonous, sometimes causing complaints about smell and blandness. Asterisk in modern grocery stores, turnips, of a kind of vegetable that get passed over without a second glance to bland, too old-fashioned to humble. But in medieval Europe, the turnip wasn't just a vegetable, it was a lifeline. When grain ran low and the bread was gone, when pottage had become more water than substance, it was the turnip that stepped up, quiet, hardy, and endlessly patient. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't flavorful, but it was reliable, and that made it priceless. Why turnips? Because they thrived where other crops failed. They didn't ask for rich soil or frequent care. You could plant them late, ignore them mostly, and still get a solid harvest. A single seed could yield 15 pounds of food, not a luxury meal, but enough to feed a family for days. And most importantly, they stored beautifully. Without refrigeration, medieval peasants needed crops that wouldn't rot within days. Turnips could sit for months in cellars, pits, or straw-lined holes in the ground. One village record from 1286 noted families surviving 7 months on turnips alone, stored in nothing more than a hole in the earth. Think about that. No modern packaging, no preservation, just earth, air, and desperation. The turnip stew was the medieval version of a microwavable dinner. Chop, boil, salt if you had it, and serve. The leaves went into the pottage, the roots into the stew, and even the flowers were edible in spring. Zero waste. That wasn't eco-consciousness, that was necessity. And while it might sound monotonous, the turnip's predictability was comforting. In a world where war, plague, and weather could rip away your food supply overnight, the turnip didn't flinch. It showed up, it stayed put, and it filled stomachs. But there was a downside, or several. Turnips reheated repeatedly developed a distinct and not so pleasant smell, a sulphurous fog that clung to homes and clothes. Medieval writers joked that eating too many turnips made your skin pale and your home unbearable, and yet people kept eating them, because the alternative wasn't better. If you asked a medieval peasant what they'd eat for a feast if they suddenly became rich, the answer might surprise you: turnips. But with meat, that humble wish speaks volumes. It wasn't that they hated turnips, it's that they had only turnips, day after day, week after week. Survival had no spice rack. Still, turnips were versatile in their own way. Combined with cabbage or onion, they became part of a power trio of medieval peasant vegetables. Together, they broke up the monotony and added texture and flavor to otherwise limp stews and soups. And as the snow melted and the land stirred back to life, the first sprouts of turnip greens were among the earliest signals that spring had arrived, not just on the calendar, but in the gut. In medieval medicine, turnips had their place too. Crushed turnip juice was used to treat coughs. Heated turnips were placed on the chest for lung ailments. One monastery record even claimed turnips banish winter's melancholy. Today, we'd call that vitamin deficiency. Back then, it was the magic of a hot root and a hopeful mind. Turnips may not grace medieval paintings or royal banquets, but make no mistake, they were the quiet soldiers of the survival war, and in the long march through famine and frost, they never abandoned their post. 5. Cabbage and onions, smelly but reliable. Cabbage grew big, stored long, including fermented sour cabbage. Onions helped flavor otherwise bland food and kept bugs away in gardens, known for causing flatulence. Monks even banned cabbage before guests arrived. Asterisk, if turnips were the dependable base of medieval peasant cuisine, then cabbage and onions were the unlikely co-stars, humble, pungent, and indispensable. These weren't side characters in the medieval survival drama. They were the supporting actors who made the grim main plot edible. Together, they did something rare for peasant meals. They brought flavor, not luxury, not sweetness, but sharp, earthy, unmistakable character. They took blandness by the throat and added a little bite. And they did it on a shoestring. Cabbage, in particular, was a peasant's dream crop. Hardy, fast-growing, and forgiving, a single plant could grow massive, up to 15 pounds. Even better, you didn't need to kill the plant to eat from it. Outer leaves could be picked as needed, while the head kept growing. It was like a vegetable that replenished itself, a sort of edible savings account. Stored properly, usually in pits lined with straw or stone, cabbage could last weeks fresh and months if fermented. That's right, sauerkraut wasn't a trendy health food in the Middle Ages. It was food security. Archaeologists have found cabbage pits with remnants from over 100 heads of cabbage, enough to feed entire communities through the winter. Onions, meanwhile, were tough and low maintenance. They grew in bad soil, stored well, and carried powerful flavors. In a culinary landscape dominated by starches and boiled roots, a chopped onion transformed a pot of mush into something memorable. It didn't hurt that onions also served double duty in the medieval garden. They were natural pest repellents, often planted alongside other crops. And in a household where every square inch of land had to justify its existence, a vegetable that protected your garden and seasoned your soup was worth its weight in gold. Together, cabbage and onions elevated even the most depressing meals. A ladle of thin pottage became a meal when these two joined the mix. Paired with a smidgen of meat, they approached luxury. Their presence turned survival into sustenance. But they weren't without side effects, namely and predictably gas. Court records from the period occasionally mention fines or discipline, meted out to monks for eating cabbage before important visitors. A flatulent choir was bad for business, apparently, yet no one gave them up. The digestive aftermath was simply the price of eating something that tasted like more than boiled sadness. Interestingly, while peasants ate these vegetables daily, rich folks viewed them with suspicion. Medieval physicians, operating under ancient Greek theories of humors, sometimes warned nobles that cabbage could cause melancholy and dull the intellect. Translation: cabbage was for poor people, which is ironic, given how much longer. Peasants lived when they actually had access to regular vegetables, compared to meat-heavy noble diets riddled with gout and indigestion. Even then, the nutritional value of cabbage and onions wasn't just incidental, it was medicinal. Boiled cabbage was used to treat digestive issues. Onion poultices were pressed against wounds and colds. In a world where doctors were rare and expensive, your garden doubled as your pharmacy. And beyond food and medicine, these vegetables were currency, literally. Tax records show peasants settling debts in onions and cabbage when coin wasn't available. It wasn't a metaphor, it was the going rate. When the harvest was poor, they were worth more than silver. It's hard to imagine today, but in medieval times, a sack of onions could mean the difference between debt and survival, between goodwill and punishment. Cabbage and onions may have smelled bad, they may have cleared rooms, but they never failed. They're people, they grew in neglected soil, they lasted through frost. They turned bland gruel into something warm and sharp and alive. They were the edible punctuation in a sentence of starches. They were what poor families reached for when they wanted a little taste of something. And in the harsh grammar of medieval life, that was everything. 6. Peas and beans. Protein powerhouses. Dried legumes provided essential protein and stored for years, often mashed into pastes and flavored with herbs or salt. Monasteries stockpiled massive amounts to replace meat during fasting days. Asterisk protein is something we rarely think about unless we're at the gym or on a diet. But in the medieval world, protein wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was a lifeline. And for the peasants, who couldn't afford regular access to meat or dairy, protein didn't come in the form of steaks or eggs. It came from the humblest, earthiest, most overlooked source: peas and beans. These weren't side dishes, they were survival. Because when you spend your days hauling stones, reaping grain, or walking behind an ox for 12 hours straight, your body isn't running on hopes and bread alone. It's crying out for something to rebuild muscle and sustain strength. Enter legumes, the underdog champions of the medieval pantry. Unlike fragile crops that demanded rich soil and careful attention, peas and beans thrived in fields already stripped of nutrients. In fact, they improved the land, fixing nitrogen into the soil so future crops could grow better. Smart peasants planted them between rows of other vegetables or after grain harvests, squeezing extra food from the same patch of land. That's not just farming, that's systems thinking, centuries before the term existed. Dried peas, in particular, were the powerhouse. Pound for pound, they packed over 25% protein, an astonishing figure for the time. One small plot could yield up to 60 pounds of dried peas, enough to sustain a family for a large chunk of the winter. And they stored beautifully. Dried properly, they could sit in barrels or clay pots for years, immune to rot and bugs. A good legume harvest wasn't just food, it was insurance. The most common preparation, mash, dried peas or beans were soaked overnight, then boiled into a thick paste. Add salt if you had it, wild herbs if you got lucky. The result wasn't pretty, more baby food than banquet, but it was powerful. It kept field hands upright, it kept mothers from fainting, it gave growing children the muscle they needed. And when times got really hard, it moved from side dish to main course. During the famine of 1315, records from one English village show families surviving for weeks on nothing but pea mash and small beer. No bread, no meat, just a warm, green paste and a few gulps of weak ale. It doesn't sound like much, but it worked. Monasteries were well aware of this. Bound by religious rules that banned meat for more than half the year, monks leaned heavily on legumes to keep going. Financial ledgers from one large abbey list over 3,000 pounds of dried peas, stocked annually for just 40 monks. That's £75 per monk. Not excess, just fuel. And speaking of value, these foods weren't just cheap fillers. They were economic assets. Stored legumes were often part of dowries, inheritance lists, and tax payments. In fact, in some areas, they were considered nearly as valuable as grain. But as with all things peasant, there was a catch. One we've already seen with cabbage and onions: flatulence. Medieval health guides warned against eating too many beans before public events, religious services, or long wagon rides. One joke from the period tells of a bean farmer who couldn't sell his crop because he'd eaten too much of it on the way to market. It's not subtle, but it speaks to a basic truth. These were foods that got the job done. They didn't win culinary awards. They weren't written into royal menus. But they built the physical bodies that built the medieval world. Fields were ploughed by backs fueled with legumes. Walls were raised by hands powered by beans. Children survived winter on nothing but dried peas and prayers. In a world where meat was a dream and milk was fleeting, peas and beans stepped into the breach. Quietly, reliably, and again and again. These weren't emergency foods. They were foundational. A medieval peasant might go weeks, even months, without a sliver of bacon, but not a week without a scoop of bean mash. It didn't matter if it was boring. What mattered was that it worked. 7. Awful, nose-to-tail nutrition. Peasants got scraps, organs, feet, heads, etc., while nobles got prime cuts. Creative meals made from pig heads, sheep lungs, cow stomachs. Offal was highly valued and even protected by law. Asterisk: when most people today think of meat, they picture prime cuts, juicy steaks, golden drumsticks, tenderloin medallions. But for medieval peasants, meat didn't arrive in symmetrical slices wrapped in plastic. It came in scraps, in secrets, in guts. It came in the form of offal. Offal, the organs, feet, heads, tails, and innards of animals, wasn't just a backup plan. For the poor, it was often the only kind of meat they'd see all year. Because when a cow or pig was slaughtered, the best parts never made it down to the village. The lord took the choice cuts. The town butcher sold the mid-grade meat. What remained was the offal, the stuff that was messy, pungent, and looked nothing like what we'd consider food today. But medieval peasants weren't picky. They were inventive. They turned what others discarded into dishes that, while not glamorous, were surprisingly clever, and sometimes even delicious. Let's start with the pig's head. After a slaughter, it might be given to peasant families as partial payment or charity, but nothing went to waste. The cheeks, tender and marbled, were seared or stewed. The ears were cleaned, sliced, thin, and fried to a crisp. The snout and lips went into jellied dishes, gelatinous and savory. The brain, scrambled like eggs. A single head could feed a family for days. Cow stomachs, sheep lungs, and even blood had their place. The stomach became the cooking vessel itself, holding haggis-like mixtures of barley, heart, and liver. Lungs were thin-sliced, fried with onions, and devoured hot. Blood, usually saved during butchering, was mixed with oats and spices and stuffed into casings to make blood pudding, a meal dense with calories and iron. These meals weren't just about thrift. They were about necessity. Organ meats spoil fast, sometimes within hours, so preservation was instant and urgent. Smoking, salting, or cooking on the spot became ritual. That's why awful meals were often tied to the act of slaughter, itself a fleeting moment of abundance before the meat turned dangerous. And it wasn't just domestic animals. Peasants living near forests took what they could. Squirrels, hedgehogs, rabbits, even rats in extreme famine. Records from one particularly brutal winter describe peasants trapping and eating badgers, foxes, and other animals considered inedible by modern standards. The unwritten rule: if it didn't kill you, it was food. This waste-nothing mindset was part culinary instinct, part survival psychology. A single cow's organs could feed several families. Meanwhile, the Lord's tenderloin fed one household, and not for long. That disparity sharpened social awareness. Stealing offal was considered nearly as severe as stealing a noble's cut. One town record finds a man 2 weeks' wages for stealing sheep, pluck the heart, liver, and lungs. In a world where money was rare and hunger was constant, those organs were a lifeline. And for many villagers, butchering day was almost ceremonial. It wasn't just about meat, it was about community. Awful meals brought people together. The smells, strong, smoky, metallic, signaled both warning and celebration. And amid the poverty, there was a kind of pride in turning waste into wealth. Awful also blurred the lines between medicine and food. Liver was believed to strengthen blood. Heart gave courage. Brains were thought to improve intelligence, though perhaps not for long. Whether those beliefs were accurate or not, they reflected a profound truth. Food had meaning, and nothing, absolutely nothing, could be thrown away. That mentality, alien to us today, was forged in the crucible of need. It was rooted in a world where you didn't just prefer to make the most of what you had to. And so peasants became masters of improvisation, alchemists of the unwanted, chefs of the unseen. The butcher's waste was the peasant's main course, and with a little smoke, a hot fire, and a strong stomach, it became sustenance, maybe even celebration. 8. Salted herring, medieval fast food, preserved in salt. Didn't need cooking. Vital during religious fasting. Huge fishing industry, distributed inland via barrels. Ate daily in many places, including monasteries, in a landlocked village, hundreds of miles from the sea, where winters were long and the fields slept under snow. One thing still found its way to the table: fish. Not fresh, not delicate, not pansy. No, we're talking about salted herring, stiff, pungent, and packed with enough salt to dry out your tongue and preserve your soul. It was the fast food of the medieval peasant. No cooking required, long shelf life, and nutritionally dense. But this wasn't a luxury. It was necessity, engineered by desperation and sustained by trade routes that moved more fish than faith. The question is, how did a fish that spoiled within 24 hours become a staple from Norway to Spain? The answer is in the salt. The medieval herring industry wasn't just big, it was a behemoth. Fishing fleets from coastal towns like Great Yarmouth hauled in tens of millions of herring each season. Ships came equipped with barrels of salt. Fishermen gutted the fish on board, packed them in layers of salt, sealed the barrels, and shipped them inland. By the time those barrels reached peasant villages, the fish were firm, preserved, and smelling of survival. You didn't need a kitchen to eat them. You didn't even need a fire. A peasant could pull a salted herring from a barrel, slap it on some dark rye bread, and walk out the door to work the fields. It was the grab-bang-go meal of the Middle Ages, the medieval equivalent of a protein bar, only greasier and significantly smellier, and the church made sure the demand never stopped. With more than half the calendar marked by meatless fasting, days, Fridays, Lent, feast eves, fish became not just popular, but mandatory. Salted herring, abundant and cheap, filled the protein gap for tens of millions. Monasteries, especially, were major buyers. One York abbey fed just 30 monks, but ordered 15,000 herring per year. That's one fish every day per monk, with extras to spare, but quantity didn't mean variety. Herring day after day took its toll. Medieval cooks got creative, soaking the fish to reduce the salt, chopping them into spreads, folding them into pies, even cooking them into porridges. Still, herring fatigue was real. Some villagers joked that they'd prefer to starve than eat one more salty fish. And yet, they ate it anyway. Because it traveled, because it lasted, because it worked. In fact, salted herring helped form the backbone of medieval trade economies. It moved along the same roads as wool and wine. Towns built entire districts around fish processing. The smell was so overpowering that herring curing often happened downwind or near rivers, just to keep it tolerable. There were even two versions: white herring simply salted and packed, and red herring, which was salted and then smoked. The latter lasted longer and had a stronger taste, making it a favorite for travelers and remote villagers. But make no mistake, this wasn't romantic seaside cuisine. This was utility food, forged by the demands of faith and famine. And like everything else in the peasant diet, it was consumed with pragmatism, not pleasure. Still, for all its intensity, herring offered something precious: protein without slaughter. In hard times, when livestock had to be protected and crops failed, that barrel in the corner with its briny, oily contents represented stability. It was the unspoken promise that, no matter how bleak things got, there would be something to eat. And in a world of uncertainty, that counted for everything. 9. Ale, safer than water. Weak 1 to 3% alcohol, brewed at home, even drunk by children, safer than polluted water. Brewing killed bacteria, central to medieval life, often given as payment. Asterisk, if you could walk into a medieval village and ask what people drank, you might expect to hear about water, but that would be a deadly mistake. Because in an age where the concept of bacteria was non-existent, and latrines sat a little too close to wells, water was not to be trusted. It made people sick, sometimes fatally. So instead, everyone, from toddlers to elders, drank ale, not because they wanted to get drunk, but because it was safer than the stream outside. Ale in medieval Europe wasn't a party beverage. It was a necessity, a liquid loophole that let people hydrate without the risk of dysentery or worse. And unlike the 10% craft brews of today, this ale, known as small beer, was light, low in alcohol, and brewed fresh every few days. Think 1% to 3% ABV, just enough to keep bacteria out and flavor in. The brewing process began with something every peasant had access to: grain and fire. Women were the primary brewers. In fact, brewing was considered a domestic chore on par with baking bread. Water was boiled with malted grain, sometimes flavored with herbs, then strained and left to ferment naturally in wooden tubs or ceramic jugs. Within a day or two, you had drinkable ale, perishable, nutritious, and blessedly free of whatever lurked in the village well. But it didn't last. Without refrigeration or preservatives, ale spoiled within a week. That meant it was always local, always fresh, and always in production. Brewing was as regular as sweeping the floor. Many women brewed twice a week to keep the family stocked, juggling wooden barrels and buckets like clockwork. And they didn't just drink it, they used it. Ale was poured into bread dough for fermentation. It was served with meals. It even acted as medicine and payment. Manor records show workers being paid in both coin and gallons of ale. Build a wall. That's 3 pence and 2 gallons. Catch some rats. Here's a jug to help you forget what you just did. At harvest time, when work was hardest, the daily ration could spike to 1.5 gallons per person. That's 8 to 12 pints per day for every adult. And no, this didn't turn them into blubbering wrecks. Their tolerance was cultural. Ale wasn't recreational, it was routine. Children drank small beer with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Not to get tipsy, but because the alternative was a glass of possibly infected water. And this practice, strangely enough, kept them healthier. Modern studies suggest the boiling process and fermentation actually killed off the pathogens that water alone carried. Peasants didn't know why it worked. They just knew that it did. Ale had social power too. It was a centerpiece of community gatherings, weddings, funerals, and feast days. Stronger versions were saved for celebrations. Brewed longer, spiced, and richer in alcohol. But even those big beers rarely reached the levels we think of today. They were filling and warming, not intoxicating. And beyond hydration and ceremony, ale provided calories. Brewed from grain, it delivered carbs and trace nutrients, especially in a diet short on meat and dairy. During famines, it became a kind of meal substitute, quick energy in a mug. The church noticed. Monasteries brewed massive quantities, both for consumption and commerce. In fact, some monks became so proficient at brewing that their ale became a prized trade good, funding everything from repairs to alms. In households, brewing skills passed from mother to daughter. A well-kept brewing recipe was family gold, and some women even brewed commercially, selling surplus to neighbors and earning the nickname alewives. These women often wore tall hats, not for fashion, but visibility in the marketplace, a practice that would centuries later be twisted into the iconography of witches. Funny how survival can be mistaken for sorcery. But while ale was ubiquitous, it wasn't infinite. Grain shortages made brewing harder. Water access varied by region, and fermentation wasn't always predictable. Some batches turned foul, others turned dangerous if improperly stored. Still, compared to the risks of raw water, ale remained the best option. It gave peasants hydration, nutrition, and community, all from a few handfuls of grain and a fire. It wasn't just the drink of choice, it was the drink of survival. 10. Cider and mead, sweet sips and storage solutions. Cider came from widespread apple trees and required minimal effort. Mead made from honey, rarer due to honey's value. Both offered preservation and occasional joy in a bleak diet. In the grey routine of medieval peasant life, where every day was a negotiation with hunger and fatigue, there were rare flashes of sweetness. And in the drinkable corner of that world, those flashes came not from sugar, which was a luxury almost no one could afford, but from two ancient elixirs, cider and mead. Compared to the earthy pottage and bitter barley loaves, cider was a revelation. It tasted like fruit, felt like sunshine, and carried just enough alcohol to make your cheeks warm without blurring your thoughts. It was quite literally bottled hope. Cider's rise came down to one thing: apples. Unlike grain, which demanded cleared fields and regular care, apple trees could be planted and forgotten. They grew on rocky hillsides, among weeds, on steep slopes too rugged for plowing, and once they matured, they bore fruit for decades. For peasant families with little land, apple trees were a generational asset. Not only did they provide food, fresh or dried, but they offered something even more valuable: fermentation. Making cider didn't require expertise. You picked apples, crushed them in a wooden press, collected the juice, and let it sit. Natural yeasts on the apple skins did the rest. No special ingredients, no secret techniques, just time and patience. And the result? A mildly alcoholic drink that could be stored for months, sometimes half a year or more. That made cider one of the most efficient forms of calorie storage in a world where everything perished quickly. In lean months, when the bread ran out, a cup of cider could fill a stomach, steady the nerves, and add energy. Families learned to ration it, saving stronger batches for weddings, harvest celebrations, or religious festivals. Children drank the weaker version, just enough alcohol to preserve, not enough to intoxicate. But cider's sweetness wasn't just about taste. It was about escape. In a world without sugar, even the faint apple tints of half-fermented cider felt like a luxury. And then there was mead, older, rarer, and more elusive. Mead was the drink of honey, and honey was almost mythically valuable. To get it, peasants had to brave wild hives or maintain carefully tended beehives, using straw skeps, clay pots, or hollow logs. Getting stung was part of the price, but the reward was liquid gold. Honey was medicine, glue, hair wax, wound salve, and when mixed with water and left to ferment, it became mead. Rich, heady, and sweet, mead was the closest a peasant ever came to drinking a celebration. But unlike cider, it wasn't a regular drink. Most peasants only tasted it a few times a year, at weddings, holy days, or if someone in the family kept bees. Even then, a single batch might be rationed down to tiny cups. Yet despite its rarity, mead left a deep imprint. It was remembered, songs were sung about it, stories told around it. In a life of monotony, it stood out like a torch in darkness. And mead had practical uses too. It preserved the sugars of honey for years, far longer than raw honey alone. In an era without refrigeration, turning perishables into alcohol wasn't just clever, it was essential. It meant nothing was wasted. These drinks weren't about indulgence. They were about cleverness, resilience, and ingenuity, about using what the land gave, however little, and stretching it into sustenance that could also lift the spirit. Even the process of fermentation, which today we associate with craft breweries and hip labels, was back then just a form of everyday alchemy. With no modern science, peasants learned by feel, by taste, by watching the bubbles rise. Cider and mead weren't just beverages. They were acts of quiet rebellion against despair. And when the winter dragged on, and the stew thinned, and the bread turned green, a single sip of something sweet reminded you the earth hadn't forgotten you. Not yet. 11. Honey and berries. Rare sweet treats. Honey was precious, used for food, medicine, beauty, and hair removal. Berries were seasonal, gathered by children and women, and valued highly. Theft of honey could be punished as harshly as stealing livestock, In a world stripped of indulgence, where survival was counted in roots and rations, sweetness wasn't just rare, it was sacred. And for medieval peasants, that sweetness came not from cane sugar, which remained a luxury shipped at great cost and reserved for the clergy and elite, but from two humble, fleeting miracles, honey and wild berries. These weren't everyday items, they were seasonal, temperamental, and sometimes dangerous to gather. But when they appeared in porridge, in cider, or smeared thin on a rough slice of bread, they transformed the ordinary into the unforgettable. Let's begin with honey. This golden syrup, so rich and sticky it clung to fingers and history alike, was more than just a sweetener. It was medicine, currency, and treasure. Medieval peasants who harvested honey did so at great personal risk. Without protective gear or modern smokers, they followed bee trails into woods, smoked out wild hives, and used knives and baskets to cut away honeycomb. Many stings later, if they were lucky, they walked away with a few precious pounds of honey, enough to flavor an entire winter. But those who could afford the time and skill to build and tend hives had an edge. Old farm guides describe straw skeps, shaped like domes, placed near flowering plants to encourage healthy colonies. These hives might yield 15 to 20 pounds of honey per year, a fortune by peasant standards. So valuable was honey that beehives appeared in marriage contracts, wills, and tax assessments. Honey was not just sweet, it was wealth, and it wasn't wasted. A single spoonful might stretch across a week, dabbed into gruel for a sick child, or used to sweeten a rare celebratory cake. It treated wounds, soothed coughs, preserved herbs and roots. Some even used it in cosmetics or hair wax. Honey did everything, and everyone knew it. But if honey was the gold of the medieval pantry, wild berries were its precious stones, bright, scattered, and ephemeral. Blackberries, raspberries, blueberries, and strawberries grew wild along hedgerows, forest paths, and overgrown fields. And unlike grain, they asked for nothing. No ploughing, no watering, no taxes, just hands to pick them and baskets to carry them home. Berries couldn't be stored long, not without sugar or drying equipment, so they were eaten fresh often. Right from the bush, they were a burst of color in an otherwise brown and gray diet, a surprise at the edge of a wood, a sweet mouthful after a day of toil. And they were democratic. Rich or poor, anyone could pick them as long as they had the time and knew where to look. Children were often sent to gather berries in groups. For many, it was their only form of play. And for mothers, a few handfuls of berries meant a chance to make something joyful, a wild fruit tart, a berry mash folded into morning bread, or a rare spoonful of flavor in an otherwise bland stew. Feast records from noble estates reveal that even the upper class prized these fruits. They were served in honey glazes, in creams, or preserved in wine. But for peasants, even a plain bowl of wild berries was a memory worth holding on to. They told stories about them. They joked, if I were king, I'd eat berries with honey till my belly burst. It wasn't just food, it was fantasy. In their brief growing season, berries offered something almost supernatural, a taste that needed no salt, no fire, no preparation, just sunlight and soil. And when combined with honey, it was magic. That union, sweet fruit and golden nectar, was the medieval version of luxury. It was what peasants imagined when they thought of a better life. And they imagined it often. These tiny bursts of sugar spoke to something deeper, a longing not just for calories, but for joy. For the moment where food didn't just keep you alive, but made you feel alive. In that moment, it didn't matter that your boots had holes, that your hands were cracked from labor, or that the winter loomed again. For a minute, life was sweet. 12 chestnuts and acorns, emergency forest food. Chestnuts were sweet, easy to store or grind into flour. Vital in France, Italy, Spain. Acorns needed soaking to remove toxins, but were a famine staple. Forest access for nut gathering was legally protected. Asterisk, when the harvest failed and grain stores ran dry. When bread shrank into bitter crusts and stew turned into boiled water. Medieval peasants didn't surrender. They looked to the trees, not for metaphorical inspiration, but for calories. Because the forests that lined their villages weren't just wild barriers, they were backup pantries. And in those pantries, two particular treasures stood out: chestnuts and acorns. These weren't snack foods or woodland delicacies. They were survival staples, nut-born miracles that filled bellies when the fields gave up. Let's start with chestnuts, the bread of the trees. In parts of France, Italy, and Spain, chestnut groves were considered as vital as grain fields. A single mature tree could drop over 200 pounds of nuts in a good year. That wasn't dessert. That was life insurance. Chestnuts didn't need much. They grew in hilly, rugged terrain, often unsuitable for crops. Once established, they bore fruit for generations. Medieval families built their food security around these trees, passing them down in wills and settling disputes over their branches. When autumn arrived, families gathered them by the sack, roasted over fire, boiled into porridge, or ground into flour. Chestnuts became everything from bread to filler for soups and pottages. The flour didn't rise like wheat, but it filled the gap, chewy, smoky, and sustaining. Records from certain regions show that chestnuts made up nearly 20% of winter diets, and they stored well. Dried chestnuts lasted 4 months. Some were buried in sand to preserve freshness. Others were hung from rafters in mesh sacks. In a good year, a family could eat chestnuts into spring. But when chestnuts weren't available, or famine struck harder than anyone could prepare for, peasants turned to a much more difficult friend, the acorn. Acorns, unlike chestnuts, are bitter, loaded with tannins that make them inedible raw. But medieval peasants, ever resourceful, knew how to make them work. First, they were crushed or ground. Then, soaked in repeated changes of water, sometimes cold, sometimes hot, to leach out the bitterness. The process could take days, using up precious fuel and time. But the result? A coarse acorn meal that could be baked into emergency. Bread added to porridge or thickened into cakes. It wasn't pleasant. It was gritty, earthy, sometimes bitter even after all that effort. But it was food, and in the darkest famines, that was enough. During the great European famines of the 14th century, court records document fights over nut-gathering rights. Whole families ventured deep into forests to collect acorns, chestnuts, and hazelnuts, often risking wild animals, trespassing laws, or violent confrontation. In some villages, nut trees were so valuable they were taxed separately. A tree might feed a family for a month. A grove could sustain a whole hamlet. And unlike grain, nuts weren't subject to the same vulnerabilities. No mildew, no rot from wet fields, just branches, sun, and time, that made them not only famine food, but strategic reserves. Clever peasants gathered and dried nuts even in good years, storing them for the lean ones they knew were coming. Because in the medieval world, famine wasn't a question of if, It was when the forest didn't offer comfort. It didn't offer flavor, but it offered calories. And in the cruel mathematics of survival that made it sacred, chestnuts warmed the stomach, acorns scratched it, but both kept people alive, and both speak to the larger truth that runs through every part of this story. Peasants didn't eat like we do. They ate like the world might end tomorrow, because sometimes it did. 13. Wild greens and foraged foods, seasonal saviors, nettles, dandelions, mushrooms, and herbs supplemented diets. Women were often skilled foragers and crucial during famines. Wild plants could make up over 30% of diets during hard times. Among the dirt paths, mossy woods, and hedgerows that fringed medieval villages, another pantry grew silent, green, and often overlooked. It didn't come with harvest festivals or tax records. It wasn't tracked in church ledgers or tallied in noble inventories. But for those who lived close to hunger, it was as essential as bread. It was the world of wild plants, foraged greens, herbs, and edible weeds, the invisible ingredients that filled in the blanks of the medieval diet. And those blanks were vast. You couldn't always count on a good barley yield. The cabbages might freeze. The pottage pot might thin out too soon. But if you knew where to look, the forest and field would give you nettles, dandelion, sorrel, lamb's quarters, chickweed, wild garlic, and dozens more. These weren't luxuries, they were stopgaps, vitamins wrapped in thorns, flavor growing in the mud, and they made the difference between weakness and survival. Spring was their high season, the hungry months, when winter stores ran low and nothing had yet grown in the fields. Peasants called it the starving time, but even then the woods whispered solutions. Nettles, sharp, stinging, and loaded with iron, were boiled into soups. The sting disappeared, but the nutrients remained. Sorrel brought us citrus. Bite 2 bland stews. Chickweed added bulk and a pleasant crunch. Wild garlic, the closest thing many would ever taste to spice. These plants weren't glamorous. They weren't prepared with ceremony, but they worked, and the knowledge of them was passed down with quiet precision. Every village had its expert, often a woman who could name the edible from the poisonous, who knew which mushrooms were safe, where the best berries grew, and which greens came first after the thaw. These women weren't just gatherers, they were walking archives. During the famines of the early 1300s, these skills became the difference between starvation and survival. One account from the Great Famine tells of entire communities living almost entirely on gathered greens and tree bark for weeks at a time. Think about that, living not off what you grew, but what you found. And this foraging wasn't guesswork, it was strategic. Wild foods followed the seasons. Spring brought greens. Summer meant berries and mushrooms. Autumn brought nuts, rose hips, and wild apples. Peasants rotated their collection sites, used specific baskets to avoid cross-contamination, and even had unwritten rules about who gathered, where some forests had legal gleaning rights, allowing peasants to collect wild plants even on land they didn't own. Violating those rights led to court disputes. That's how valuable these plants were. Even their names reflected their purpose: Good King Henry, Fat Hen, Poor Man's Pepper. They weren't food in the traditional sense. They were food when everything else failed. And they added something rare to the peasant diet: color, texture, a bitter note to balance the bland, a crunch to interrupt the mush, a flicker of green against a backdrop of grey. Medicinally, they mattered too. Wild herbs were used to treat wounds, fevers, digestive troubles, and even emotional ailments. Monks documented hundreds of these plants in their herbals, but peasants had their own traditions, rooted in folk knowledge, not Latin. They didn't write it down, they lived it. That kind of knowledge was icily dismissed by nobles who saw it as superstition. But the numbers told a different story. Studies of medieval diets suggest that foraged plants made up 5 to 10% of total food intake in normal years. During famine, that jumped to 30% or more. When bread vanished and beans ran out, weeds became dinner. It's humbling to think that what we mow down or spray with chemicals today once saved entire communities. Dandelions were more than weeds. They were salad, they were soup, they were life. The forest wasn't just a place of shadows and danger. It was a place of possibility. You just had to know where to look. 14. Ash cakes, desperation, bread. Flat cakes of whatever grain or filler was left, cooked in fire ashes, made from acorns, bark, or even floor dust during famine. Quick to cook and purely functional, often gritty and bitter. Theirs. A kind of meal that only appears when everything else is gone. No more flour, no more beans, no more roots, no forest greens, no trade, no hope, just hunger and a will to fight it. That meal, if it can even be called that, is the ash cake. Primitive, gritty, and borderline inedible, ash cakes were. A last resort, a culinary SOS scraped together from the very edges of survival. But when all else failed, they were what stood between a peasant and the void. The idea was brutally simple. Take whatever you had, and in the worst times, whatever meant the dust swept off the granary floor, mix it with water into a thick paste, flatten it into a cake, and bake it directly in the hot ashes of a fire. No pan, no pot, no oven, just desperation, a hearth, and a prayer that your teeth wouldn't break on the result. In times of famine and the Middle Ages saw plenty, these cakes became common. Records from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 describe peasants baking bread from ground bark, acorns, dried roots, and even hay. When nothing else remained, people sifted the dirt of their grain stores, collecting husks and floor dust to form the base of their ash cakes. The result was more ash than cake, blackened, bitter, gritty, and barely digestible. But it was something, and in famine math, something beat nothing. Cooking in ashes might sound grotesque to modern ears, but it was an ancient method. Even before medieval times, nomadic cultures and early farmers used embers as ovens. But while other foods embraced the ashes for flavor or convenience, ash cakes were born out of necessity. They weren't rustic cuisine, they were edible despair. Yet in their own way, they were ingenious. They required no tools, no yeast, no firewood, beyond what the hearth already gave, and they cooked fast, crucial when fuel was scarce and bellies demanded speed. Laborers sometimes made them in the fields, quickly baking a meal during short breaks between endless hours of work. Medieval work songs mentioned them as a meal for the moving, a bread you could eat with one hand while the other held a plough. Their taste, somewhere between scorched bitterness and gritty paste. One old joke claimed, "Ash cakes are best when dropped in the mud first. The mud covers the flavor." Another said, "They crunch like bones and taste like regrets." But people ate them, not because they wanted to, because they had to. And this is where the real lesson of the ash cake lives, not in its texture or flavor, but in its psychology. Making ash cakes wasn't just about surviving physically. It was about refusing to surrender, about taking the last possible scraps and still turning them into nourishment, however meager. It was the culinary equivalent of hope, a quiet, bitter, bite-sized rebellion against death. Even peasant manuals and farming treatises acknowledged this. A 16th century text reads, "When grain fails and bread cannot be made in the usual way, the wise peasant remembers the ways of cooking in ash, for it has saved our people since time beyond memory." That line says it all. Ash cakes were ancestral knowledge. They were remembered because they worked, because they stood the test of not just time, but terror. Today, we have meals we forget moments after eating. But ash cakes, no one forgot those. They were meals that marked you, that left you changed. And when the famine finally lifted, when barley was harvested again, and ovens fired back to life, the ash cake disappeared, not into obscurity, but into memory, a symbol of just how far people would go to keep their children fed, to stay on their feet, and to say, not today, not yet. 15. Whatever we have meals, kitchen improvisation. Most peasant meals were unscripted, bits of everything thrown together, rooted in necessity and seasonality, inspired later rustic European dishes. Even holidays meant only slight upgrades to these improvised staples. Asterisk at the heart of every medieval peasant kitchen, if you could even call it a kitchen, was not a cookbook, not a recipe, not even a fixed set of ingredients. What existed instead was a philosophy. Cook with what you've got, waste nothing, and make it stretch. This wasn't a culinary trend. It was survival alchemy. The ultimate expression of this ethos was what peasants called, in essence, whatever. We have meals, unpredictable, ever-changing, always improvised. Today, it might be romanticized as rustic cuisine or fridge clean-out stew. But in the Middle Ages, it was daily life. There was no set list of ingredients. The only constant was the pot. Into it went the leftovers of everything else. Wilted turnips, the last onion, a scoop of old pottage, the final crumbs of barley, a pinch of dried peas, wild greens gathered that morning, a splash of small beer. If there was meat, it was the last sliver of a pig's ear, or the boiled down bone from a celebration weeks ago. If there was bread, it was stale and soaked in broth to revive it. There were no fixed proportions, no measurements, no timers. The cook judged readiness by smell, by sound, by instinct honed from hunger. If you were lucky, the meal was thick and filling. If you weren't, it was soup on the edge of being tea. But either way, it was dinner. This kind of adaptive cooking came from necessity, but it created something remarkable, resilience through food. It was peasant ingenuity boiled into a bowl, and it made the medieval kitchen, for all its scarcity, a space of experimentation. Over time, some of these whatever we have meals solidified into cultural staples. Italy's reheated vegetable and bread stew began as just that. France's ratatouille, originally just leftover garden vegetables sautéed together, came from the same survival instinct. In Spain, migas turned breadcrumbs and scraps into a national dish. In England, Bubble and Squeak mashed yesterday's cabbage and potatoes into a new creation. The origin stories are everywhere, rooted in kitchens where the only rule was to use what you had and make it taste like it wasn't a compromise. On feast days, these everyday stews were sometimes elevated with a saved pinch of spice, a splash of cider, or a rare touch of meat. The addition was often small, symbolic even, but it transformed the mood. Suddenly, the meal was a celebration, not just of food, but of endurance. These meals were also communal. A single pot might feed a family, neighbors, or field hands. People brought what they had, a leek, a crust, a scoop of beans, and what came out of the pot belonged to everyone. It turned hunger into solidarity, and it taught a lesson we often forget today. Eating isn't about having everything. It's about making something with what you have. Peasant meals were never about satisfaction in the modern sense. No one leaned back and said, "I'm stuffed." Instead, they finished their bowls, wiped the spoon, and said, "That'll do." And then they went back to work. Because food wasn't entertainment. It was fuel. But behind that fuel was a kind of quiet artistry. A commitment to making flavor where none should exist. To preserving dignity through dinner. And to honoring every scrap, every peel, every bone as part of the sacred economy of not wasting. In a way, these meals were more than food. They were memory. They held stories of bad harvests and kind neighbors, of last-minute foraging trips, of moments where someone gave their only onion to improve a pot for others. And while nobles dined on courses served by candlelight, peasants looked into the same stew they'd seen all week and found, somehow, just enough difference to keep going. Hunger makes things matter, and in the medieval peasant home, whatever. We have meals were proof that even the most threadbare lives could contain flavor, variation, even the smallest spark of creativity. When every day could be your last, these meals were a quiet, determined way of saying, "We're still here." When we picture the Middle Ages, we often imagine knights, castles, plagues, and pageantry. But beneath that surface lies the real story, told not in battles or royal decrees, but in bowls of pottage, in blackened bread, in pots that never left the hearth. It's a story written in hunger and ingenuity, in the silent brilliance of people who had almost nothing and still managed to feed their families. Day after day, season after season. Medieval peasants didn't just survive, they created a food culture built on resilience, thrift, and resourcefulness. They ate what the land allowed, turned scraps into staples, and treated every meal, no matter how meager, with reverence. They invented sustainability long before it had a name. They didn't waste. They didn't overindulge. They honored their food because their lives depended on it. And perhaps that's the final lesson, that comfort doesn't always come from abundance, but from gratitude, from community, and from the quiet power of making do. In a world bursting with choice, we often forget the value of the simple, the hard-earned, and the shared. The meals that once kept peasants alive may seem grim by modern standards, but they carry a truth we'd do well to remember. Nourishment isn't always about flavor. Sometimes it's about faith, about the belief that tomorrow might come, and that there will be just enough in the pot to meet it.